So up next, we have Isaac Bryan. He is a graduate student in the School of Public Policy. So join me, give me a warm welcome for Isaac Bryan. He's going to be talking about the recent disparities in cannabis arrests in LAPD right around the time of legalization. So thank you, Isaac.
Thank you. I know that there's a break after this, so I will do my best to keep you engaged and be succinct with the points that I'm trying to make. We all know that heavy drug enforcement was ramped up in the 1970s and persisted and still persists to a large degree, but in the wake of cannabis legalization, there's now been a look at what that means in terms of the impact it's had historically and what that means in terms of letting folks into the new market and how do we enforce and prop up the new market given this historical framework. And so those are some of the things I'd like to talk about today. But first, I'd like to introduce my team. Part of the $1 Million Hoods team here on campus. It's run out of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies, and it's our project lead is Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who is a professor in our history department. And our $1 Million Hoods team is a unique team. We're a multidisciplinary team. In that picture, there's PhDs in public health, PhDs in education. There's 4 MPPs, professors of history, and a number of students who have been formerly incarcerated themselves, but are studying here on UCLA's campus. And the work that we do is largely around criminal justice and public safety research. We've done reports on bail, we've done reports on policing the homeless, and we focus mostly in Southern California. And the reason we're able to do this work came with securing unique data. Kelly Lytle Hernandez engaged in what I would refer to as aggressive negotiation with the Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, and a number of other municipal public safety agencies. And in that battle, she was propped up by the ACLU and others and ended up winning. And in that settlement, we were given unprecedented access to law enforcement data, unlike any other group that I've heard of. So the way our process works is we secure the data. We work with these law enforcement agencies to clean the data. We then bring it in-house and we find out that it's still incredibly dirty and very hard to get clean. And so we've hired a team of researchers to just go ahead and keep cleaning it. And then we go out to the community and we ask what the community would want to query with this data. And one of the things that came up pretty quickly was cannabis, especially in the wake of legalization. And then we map and report our findings and we take them directly to policymakers. So we are cited in the city's social equity ordinance after cannabis regulations were propped up this year in the city of Los Angeles. I'll talk more about that. In the city of Los Angeles, cannabis is legal, kind of, as we all know here. It's still federally illegal, and so there are a number of problems with bankings and others, and I'm sure there are people in this room who can speak better to that than I can. But one of the things that the city of Los Angeles wanted to do, is trying to do, is not doing well enough yet, in my opinion, is set up this new cannabis market with a social equity framework. And what does social equity mean is something that the city wanted to define, needed to define, and we came in to help do that. So in our mind, social equity really has 3 components. Expungement, which is granted in Prop 64, right? You have the right to have your record expunged if you were arrested for something that is now legal, such as selling or using cannabis. Licensing. That's a huge, huge issue in this city because we've had the Prop D medical industry up for a number of years. And that industry, as we know, is not an incredibly diverse industry. There are many barriers to entry. And as a result, they're highly concentrated in certain racial populations and in certain parts of the city. And the other thing we're curious about and looking at setting up is a new enforcement framework. You can't have a new legal industry if you're not enforcing on illicit dealers. But if we tax at too high of a rate, or there are other incentives to make a profit in an illicit side market, that side market is still going to be there. And so what do we do about that? Or at least what should we be thinking about as we decide what to do about that? And those are some of the questions that we looked to answer. So what we did is we went back to 2012. We have data back to 2010, but it really is so dirty that the only clean data set that we got in a single PRA at one time was from 2012 to 2016. And I cleaned that up, and I filtered it out by cannabis related offenses. It's Penal Code 11357 to 11362. We had some lawyers on the team, and what we found is that there are roughly 7,500 cannabis-related arrests from 2012 to 2016. And of those arrests, 70% were from Black and brown communities. Interesting to note, though, Latinos are the plurality of our population, and they were not overrepresented in arrests relative to their proportion in the population. Black folks in Los Angeles, though, were the only racial group that was overrepresented. It's 9% of the city's population, 8% of the county's population. They were over 34% of total cannabis arrests. Another interesting thing that we've been able to do is we were the first group that was able to quantify how much bail was levied in the city of Los Angeles, which hadn't been done by municipalities. So we wanted to keep that framework as we looked at cannabis, something that is now legal. How much bail was paid for those who were arrested on a cannabis-only related charge? And that bail paid was nearly $8 million over the span of 5 years, 2012 to 2016 in our study. And that's really important for a number of individuals that are looking at the health implications of this, the economic implications of this, and what this might do to exacerbate barriers to entering the cannabis industry. We know, for those who don't know, I'll say, bond is paid by those who can't afford to pay their bail in cash. If you're rich, you can pay your bail in full, and you have that cash returned to you at the conclusion of your court proceedings. If you're unable to post your bail in full and in cash, you have two options. One is to contract a private bonds agent and pay a percentage of your bail in the form of a non-refundable bond payment, which is what we're talking about here. And the other is to remain incarcerated pre-trial, having never been convicted of a crime yet. So this was money that was extracted in non-refundable bond payments for cannabis-related offenses. So these were poor folks arrested for cannabis who couldn't afford to pay their bail and still paid a non-refundable payment to a bonds agent. But it's important to think about, where did we arrest? Top 5 zip codes were 9003, 90011, 90037, 90044, 90043, representing close to half of all arrests. For anyone who's familiar with some of those zip codes, I'll show you where they are. They are right in South LA, historic South Central. This map right here is broken up by city council district, because I'm a policy student and I think it's important for council members to know what's happening in their districts. That's CD8 and CD9. So in thinking about the broader framework of why this is important in this new market and setting it up, it's particularly important in terms of licensing, expungements, and enforcement. Another interesting thing to note is collectively persons that were arrested for a cannabis-related offense lost a collective 25 years of time in society to incarceration during the 5 years of our study. And that's an incredibly conservative estimate, because this data came from LAPD. LAPD can only hold you for up to 96 hours or so, really only 72, before they have to transfer you to LA County Jail. So if we were to follow these folks through county jail, as a number of them have gone, that number is actually higher. 10 years of that 25 years was lost to Black folks in Los Angeles. There's some additional costs to consider in terms of what this damage has done and what damage we might continue to do, some of which we haven't done in this study, but I'd like to throw out there for others in the room who might look at it, is how might this legacy of cannabis enforcement and arresting impact generational wealth, generational family unification, and all the positive social determinants of health that are associated with strong social ties. How does this affect mental and emotional health and well-being, and what might be the long-term implications of our historic legacy? And then, of course, financial. What has this done in terms of cost to the community? I can tell you that $8 million came out, but what really has been extracted in financial resources from this time incarcerated for cannabis-related offense, especially now in this contemporary history from 2012 to 2016. So how might this historical framework impact policy? The city's looking to set up a social equity ordinance that takes into account geographic locations or hotspots of previous enforcement to give them priority licensing. The current way the ordinance is set up is the Prop D dispensaries come through first, Then the social equity lens comes in after social equity applicants, and then it's kind of like a 1-1-1-1 through the commission in the normal process. But that's very important to think about how to ensure that these groups and areas that have been historically targeted for prohibition enforcement are now part of the market, especially for our urban planners and housing scholars that know that gentrification is moving rapidly in a number of these zip codes. Are they going to be the same zip codes that were over-enforced in 2012 here over the next few years and beyond? And what kind of monitoring do we need to do to make sure that our newly licensed recreational market is as diverse as our city is? The other thing that I'm particularly interested in right now is enforcement. I've had kind of this fear that we're now going to enter this age where poor folks and community of color are now over-policed more so than ever in the cannabis market, because before it was just illegal, and now it's illegal, and there's a organized business industry that wants you out. And in that concern, I've thought critically and talked with a number of city officials about what might an enforcement framework look like. And they're actually still establishing it. It's not up and running yet. But our gut instinct is always to go with LAPD first. And under the new laws that are in place, just operating a illicit cannabis retail location is a misdemeanor criminal offense. And LAPD can come through and the city attorney can file cases on it. But if you keep this historic framework in focus, particularly since the social equity component of licensing hasn't gone out yet in others, I think it's important to think critically about what other tools the city might possess. For example, one of the things that I would like to pitch to policymakers and continuing to hold those conversations is that we better utilize DWP, the fire department, and building and safety department. We can shut down, we can bar entry, and we can turn off power to illicit operators without keeping this overly punitive criminal justice arm going. And I think that's an important thing for us to think about as we head to this new market. The most important thing about this research and about these conversations is that I think LA is about to pilot a model that can be used statewide and across the country as other municipalities and states begin to look at this. And I think having this social equity and historic framework propped up and ready to go and proving that we've done this right is pretty important for the entire country and other municipalities. Break time.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Do you have any specific data on driving under the influence and roadside arrests? The reason why I'm asking is because, as you know, in the state of California, actually in no other state of the union, there is really an objective way of determining cannabis-dependent intoxication. And that is obviously an issue that, regardless of the legalization, the legal status of cannabis will remain. And currently, what happens to LAPD, any other police in the state, stops people drivers who appear to be erratic, and then if one of the appropriate officers who is trained to do it is present, he or she will perform a test that is essentially a psychological test. So the reason why I'm asking is because psychological tests are by definition prone to racial bias. So I was wondering whether you looked into the data, and I think it's extremely important at this point to determine how biased these assays are, because we are in a position where we can actually develop assays that are not biased, objective neurobiological assays.
Thank you. That's an incredible question. I think many people in the room know, too, driving under the influence of cannabis is largely subjective in terms of tolerance. What a previous use for you means to someone else who's a daily smoker or a daily user is different. And there's where some of the bias comes in. And looking at the historical data, we noticed that driving under the influence of cannabis was very, very, very low. Very low. In fact, the overwhelming majority of these charges were intent to distribute, which is also subjective in charging, largely by how much quantity you have on you. If there happened to be a scale or bags or something nearby, officers have a lot of discretion in that regard. But I do think, to your point, that's something that we're going to have to pay very close attention to moving forward, along with all of these other new things about using in sensitive areas, or I've heard anecdotal stories of sheriffs driving by currently legal operators looking for folks using when they come out, which is also illegal. Being on the side of the street, smoking or eating an edible or using oil is also illegal. And I think there's a lot of subjectivity that could lead to increased disparities long term if we don't look at that. So historically, I don't think the data supports that there's a big disparity in what you're talking about, but I do think going forward, we need to set up the tools and we need to monitor this closely.
Quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
What are some other specific examples of cannabis-related offenses?
Of cannabis what?
Related offenses.
It is driving. It is possession. It's largely possession, different kinds of possession based on quantity, whether it goes from a felony to a misdemeanor, possession with intent to sell. There's cultivation. There's manufacturing. There's different kinds of distribution codes. And so we really aggregated all of those. But I think the overwhelming majority, as I mentioned before, were possession or possession with intent to sell.
Thank you.
I think it's a very important thing that you are doing. This work is wonderful. I'm just a little concerned because the data that you collect are before legalization of marijuana or cannabis. But once it's legalized, all the data, all the information will be totally different from before that. So that's a break between now versus before. So it may not apply to the future.
Right.
So maybe we should learn something about other substances historically, like cigarettes, things like that, and how they affect people and how we legalize them, how we control them. Maybe that will be very important for the policy making in the future.
I think that's a great point. To that question, though, I think there are a few substances that have previously been elicited and then policed in these communities in the same way that cannabis has. And since we have yet to legalize cocaine or different types of street opioids, I think we won't quite find the same history with tobacco use or alcohol during Prohibition. So to your point, I think we need to collect this data ongoing in the future and evaluate it. I think most of this presentation is kind of like a preemptive warning that we need to be on the lookout and we need to be cognizant of what we've done before as we set up this new multi-billion-dollar industry. Thank you, though. I think that's a great point.
Hi. Sorry. So as a physician, I see a lot of patients. Most of my patients who are Black are really hesitant to use cannabis as a medical perspective because of all of the things that you were just talking about, because so many of their relatives, friends, neighbors, etc., had such dire legal consequences and were put in jail that they're not even willing to open their eyes to the aspect of the medical aspect to cannabis. Do you think that that's something that we need to be educating in those certain areas where, those 5 top zip codes? Do we need to talk about how this actually can be used as a medical perspective? Is that something that we haven't even approached or discussed?
I think there's definitely an educational, thank you for your question. I think there's definitely an educational component to this because there is a huge stigma. But another thing that we've yet to figure out in our policy is in terms of being on probation or any form of community supervision. Right. Where using cannabis, even though it's legal, can still be a violation of probation or parole, which could be a very tragic story if you were put on community supervision for a cannabis-related offense previously.
So there are rules for that? Like if you're on probation now that it's legalized, it's not?
No, not yet. And that's something we need to think about and talk about as well, because these communities, we've noticed a severe overlap in our cannabis enforcement and just enforcement in general in certain communities. And these communities also have a disproportionate representation of folks under community supervision for a whole host of reasons. And so I think taking cannabis off the list of violatable offenses is something, pragmatic policy we need to talk about.
Hi. So, from my experience, how do you foreshadow social equity? And as you're saying in your presentation, you want to allocate more licenses over to those areas that have higher crime rates, correct? Or not
Yes.
higher crime rates, but higher
Yes,
rates for that. So, from my experience, theft in an all-cash business usually seems to be an issue, especially, in this type of retail setting. How do you foreshadow that being, moving forward?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we need a number of other scholars to work on addressing that issue and finding out how we can bank responsibly with this new industry so it's not an all-cash business. But I think there might be a role for law enforcement in that regard, or in security. You really can't prepare for things like that too well because you're predicting bad behavior in a way that is stigmatizing and often rooted in our own implicit biases. Another component of this social equity conversation is to point out that social equity and diversity are not the same thing. And so talking about this citywide has been quite controversial in certain communities of color that haven't been historically policed, but feel that they should be included in the social equity component. There's really been a wealth extraction from these communities through cannabis enforcement. And I think that's the thing we need to keep in mind, more so than some of these potential pitfalls that you've mentioned. We need to think about those, but the bigger picture is that we can't not do what's right for fear of the future.
And Isaac, I have a question. So I think a lot of folks here aren't too familiar with what the social equity program actually looks at, and they might be familiar with maybe what the goal is. Maybe you could talk briefly about that and why it's unique to LA.
Yeah, so the social equity program is very unique to LA, although it's based on a model that was started in Oakland. And it really was to do just that, to look at the historic disenfranchisement and over-policing of the most impacted communities in the city and find a way to ensure that those areas got to participate in this newly licensed recreational and retail market. And so the way that the city did it in conjunction with us was to map out the city and find out where the hotspots were of residents, and not just LAX and traveling hotspots, but folks that actually live here. And so we were able to get home addresses in our data sets, and so we were really able to map exactly where it was important. The other thing is, because of Prop 209 and other things, you can't just outright say we need to give black folks licenses. Right? You can't say that we need to give communities, brown communities and South Central licenses, but you can do a geographic-based look at equity. And so that's what we decided to do. But that has a number of caveats, including the swinging communities due to gentrification, due to displacement, and just the diaspora of racial ethnicities in the city and how those are changing. And so that's something we have to be cognizant of. Even if we set this up with all the best intentions and with all the best historical data, we need ongoing long-term data to make sure that we're evaluating and critiquing policy in the way that is true to its intent. So that's the plan. Like I said, it hasn't gone up and running yet. A social equity ordinance has passed through the city.
May I have your attention?
And we have our break. Round of applause to Isaac. Thank you very much, Isaac. Fascinating talk.